The world is facing a 1938 moment. Britain's Foreign Secretary has warned as he compared Vladimir Putin's campaign in Ukraine to Hitler's actions in Europe on the eve of World War II.
Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of yet. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with those comments by Lord Cameron speaking in Brussels at a NATO summit. He said he's compared the crisis facing Europe and the world to 1938, and that is a comparison to the Munich conference, the Munich agreement, when Britain, France and fascist Italy decided to appease Nazi Germany after Hitler had annexed the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in 1938. Now that episode is widely seen as an action of appeasement, that the Allies, or that rather Britain and French allies, appeased Adolf Hitler and less than a year later found themselves fighting World War II.
What we face today is as simple as then. We have a tyrant in Europe who's trying to redraw borders by force, and there are two choices. You can appease that approach, or you can confront that approach. It is undoubtedly the right thing to confront it, and that is what we're doing by giving Ukraine such strong support.
David Cameron urged allies to step up their support for Ukraine to continue that confrontation, but he did say that NATO troops would not be sent to Ukraine because he said that would give Russia a target. And significantly for Ukraine, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said in no uncertain terms that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And of course, that is a key desire of Kyiv to join the alliance, to try and protect itself ultimately from the sort of Russian aggression that it is facing at the moment. But it cannot join whilst it is at war. So this is something that Ukraine wants, something that NATO has signalled it will support, but a process that is likely to take time. NATO, to mark its anniversary, has been putting out various messages, and one of those messages is not only just how successful it sees this alliance as having been. It was formed in 1949 with 12 members. It has grown this year to 32 members with the accession of Sweden and Finland. And of course, the key clause in the NATO alliance is that an attack on one member will be treated as an attack on all. And that is the deterrent that NATO offers its members to try and discourage enemies, principally Russia, from attacking any of its members. One of the messages it's been putting out is how much stronger NATO sees itself compared to Russia, having a combined GDP 20 times the size of Russia's, having a combined armed forces of some 3.2 million men and women under arms, about 2 million more than Russia's standing forces. But nonetheless, for all that talk, NATO finds itself in a fairly fraught situation as well, because it is facing the possibility of another Donald Trump presidency. And Donald Trump has in the past made some fairly outlandish comments, not least suggesting that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO members who fail to pay their way within the alliance. Now, the alliance's target is for those members to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. And from Donald Trump's point of view, that was about making sure that NATO members pay for themselves rather than leaning on the crutch of America. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has recently announced a plan to try and raise a $100 billion NATO fund to spend on and in Ukraine over the next 5 years. And that has widely been interpreted as an attempt to try and future-proof the alliance's support for Ukraine against the possibility of a Donald Trump presidency. Worth noting, this comes as $100 billion of American military aid for Ukraine continues to be held up on Capitol Hill in Washington because Republican politicians have refused to back a White House plan. Interestingly, mixed messages today appearing to come out of Russia in response to, or rather reflecting, this NATO anniversary. We've heard from President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, saying that NATO and Russia are already in a direct confrontation. I think that's something perhaps that NATO would disagree with, whilst NATO continues to support, in its words, a sovereign country, Ukraine, to resist Russia. NATO forces are not directly taking part in that conflict. Interestingly, Russia's deputy foreign minister has said that were any NATO bases to appear on Ukrainian soil, then those bases would burn. That's pretty forceful language from him. But strangely, Andrei Kalin, Russia's ambassador to London, appeared to strike a slightly more conciliatory tone when he said that suggestions that Europe or the world was in a pre-war era were overblown, and he tried to focus he suggested that the dispute between the world and Russia was limited to Ukraine, and if that issue could be resolved, then the prospect of World War III would dissipate, would be further away. Of course, I've spoken a lot today about words, about what's being said in Brussels and NATO and what's being said in Moscow. It's worth remembering what is happening in Ukraine. Another drone bombardment in Kharkiv has killed at least 4 people, 3 of them emergency first responders who had gone to the scene of the initial strike and were killed in a double tap. That strike eliciting condemnation from President Zelensky. It comes just days after similar strikes in Kharkiv caused a massive energy blackout. Some 350,000 people plunged into darkness, and Ukraine saying today that it needs to totally overhaul its energy system in an attempt to try and decentralize it, to try and make it more resilient to these sorts of attacks. Russia has launched a concerted campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure to try and cripple the heating and power networks. That started in the first winter of the war in what ultimately became a failed and unsuccessful attempt both to cripple the infrastructure but also to break the morale of ordinary people to fight. That morale is partly contingent on the ongoing support that Ukraine continues to get from the West. Since our last update, President Zelensky has signed a law lowering the age of enlistment in Ukraine from 27 to 25, which means young men can now be forced to join the army if they're 25 and older. And that is a reflection of the shortages of trained fighting men at the front lines, a reflection of the heavy losses that Ukraine has suffered both in terms of dead and injured over the last 2 years. They haven't announced the same waves of mobilization that we've seen in Russia, and Ukraine has not plundered its prisons for cannon fodder soldier like the Russians have. It is no surprise then, given what has been happening, particularly what's been happening against the energy infrastructure, that the message from Ukraine's foreign minister today, Dmitry Kuleba, is that they need more air defences. This is a familiar refrain, but we're hearing it again today. Kuleba saying at the NATO summit he doesn't want to spoil the party, but patriots. They need patriots. Those are the US-made air defence systems. He says they remain the only effective air defence for Ukraine at shooting down Russian ballistic missiles. And while they have some, they don't have enough. And of course, they are using them. They are burning through the missiles that those Patriot batteries require. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you do have questions, please write them in the comments below on YouTube, and we'll endeavour to answer some of them next time. The first question today is about ammunition, and particularly about Czech-led plans to provide 800,000 shells to Ukraine. And the question is, most of those Czech shells are likely to be Soviet caliber 152 ammunition, and the question suggests that Ukraine has pivoted over to NATO standard ammunition 155 as a result of the guns that have been provided by NATO allies to Ukraine, and therefore are these shells redundant? The short answer is Ukraine has not made a full transition from Soviet weapons to NATO weapons. It is using both weapons in tandem. It is using all the weapons it has and it can get its hands on, and whatever ammunition it can supply them with. So whilst NATO allies have supplied a great many number of both artillery guns, tracked artillery vehicles and tanks, which all require this sort of ammunition, Ukraine still has a large number of its legacy weapons and it's using those. So much of that Czech ammunition will be used for Soviet-era weapons that Ukraine still has. Question number 2 is, what is the best outcome for Ukraine? The person suggesting that Russia is unlikely to leave Ukraine while Vladimir Putin is alive. Well, Ukraine's stated objectives are to repel all Russian forces from its borders, and those are the independence borders from 1991. So that would mean not just pushing Russian forces back from the territory they've gained since the full-scale invasion 2 years ago. That would mean pushing Russian forces out of the eastern Donbass, which was annexed by a Russian-backed rebellion in 2014, and of course pushing Russian forces out of the Crimean Peninsula, also seized by Russia's Little Green Men in 2014. Now, that is a best case scenario for Ukraine. As the war grinds on, there are some who suggest it seems harder and harder to envisage that possibility, but nonetheless it remains their goal. Of course, there was a suggestion last year from a NATO official that he thought the most likely outcome would be that Ukraine might cede territory for NATO membership. Now, that would be a painful outcome for both sides, both for Ukraine and for Russia. Painful for Ukraine to cede territory, painful for Russia to see Ukraine join NATO, but it's perhaps because of that mutual dissatisfaction, but that both sides might get something they want, that it seems like potentially a realistic option. Obviously, a lot can change, and at the moment, neither side showing any appetite to stop fighting. And finally today, the third question is, where can we find out which countries have given what military aid to Ukraine, and specifically asking, has Italy given anything? The short answer is yes, Italy has given artillery guns, it's given armoured vehicles, it's supplied, I think, at least one MLRS, multiple launch rocket system. Those systems have been immensely valuable to Ukraine. Now, the place I go to get this information is the ORYX blog. Hopefully a link will be appearing in the top right hand corner if you're watching on YouTube. We'll also put the link in the show notes, both on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast, if you're listening to this as a podcast. And as ever, if you are listening to a podcast, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and the same again on YouTube. Do follow The Sun for the latest updates, and please remember, if you've got questions, ask them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer them next time.